just thinking this morning, so I was going through my emails and getting ready to go to work. Somebody on Facebook responded to a question I had. He'd bought himself a Janus hand-built motorcycle made in Indiana. And, I'm really impressed by the look of the bike, because it looks like one of those interwar years British with the number plate on the front fender and the whole thing. I thought that was a very cool looking bike, and the fact that they're handmade is very attractive to me. And when I asked him about it, he said, well, because of your prior life in naval aviation fighters and stuff, you probably wouldn't find it interesting because it's not a high performance bike. And I was thinking about what it is that makes one bike more attractive to a young man than another, and why we tend to have this sort of brand loyalty many times. And I was thinking in my own particular instance why I looked forward all my life to having a motorcycle that has that rondelle, the BMW rondelle there. I always wanted a BMW motorcycle. And I was thinking long and hard about that, and thinking about the fact that whenever I see my bike, whenever I see that rondelle BMW logo on the bike, I think of my best friend Russell. And that particular time in my life, when I made his friendship, it was just after I had dropped out of high school. I was barely 16 years old. I dropped out of high school. I was living in an old United Parcel truck I'd bought from a guy in Berkeley. I converted it into a rolling home. And I was basically, living out there in the street, not in the street, because I was parking in the street. But anyway, encountering some fairly dangerous situations on a fairly regular basis. But I found one night a parking space in the town of Sausalito, and had a kind of a semi-violent encounter with a guy who apparently didn't want me parking there, and he threatened me with a length of wood and kind of drove me off. And the following day I went driving by there, and I saw these guys working on a sailboat, and I went, parked my truck, and I walked down there to look at this sailboat they were working on. It was a 30-foot Chinese junk, and it was tied up alongside the seawall there in Sausalito, and I got to know the guy who had it. He had just returned from Vietnam, where he'd been a combat medic, and he bought this Chinese junk and was going to make it a peaceful home for himself after enduring the horrors of the Vietnam War. And he had a BMW R60. And anyway, I got to know him. His name was Russell. And we became fast friends. And he taught me a lot about how to get along with everybody, how to make peace with as many people as you can possibly encounter. But what's interesting about Russell is that he's from New York, a very obvious New York accent, and prior to getting drafted, he was in the Los Angeles area, and was a bit of a bodybuilder before it was cool. He'd been trained in boxing by none other than Floyd Patterson, because Russell grew up on the shores of Greenwood Lake, New York, and that's where Floyd Patterson used to train. So Russell and his identical twin brother got boxing training from Floyd Patterson. So Russ, in his appearance, looked imposing because he had been a bodybuilder. His accent was definitely the New York City sound, because Greenwood Lake's not far from New York City, and he pretty much grew up there. So he sounded like a New Yorker, looked like he could kill you, and but he was the kindest, most easygoing guy in the world. So the default position when strangers encountered Russell was like, this is a formidable guy. But what always happened was he demonstrated his peaceable nature, very peaceable nature, very kind fellow. Anyway, he and I learned boat building together, reconstructing his Chinese junk. And one day, we went into the city, into San Francisco, to go see his friend, Jansen, who had been his replacement as a combat medic in Vietnam. And it was sort of this sort of fraternal get-together again kind of moment for Russ, because he hadn't seen him in a long time. And so Russ and I took the bus into the city, and we had to walk a considerable distance from where the bus dropped us off along 19th Avenue, up into the avenues to go find, I think it was Joe Jensen was his name, Joe. Anyway, we're walking along through the avenues, and we stopped at the stoplight, and Russell smoking his Lucky Strike, and I noticed that as he was finishing his Lucky Strike, he knocked the ember from the end of the cigarette, and then he didn't just like throw it in the gutter or anything like that. He knocked the ember off the end of it, and then he stripped the paper off it and let the leaves of tobacco just fall into the gutter, and then wadded up with the remnant piece of paper, which was next to nothing, into this infinitesimal dot. And it occurred to me. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "It's a habit I can't break. I'm field stripping my cigarettes so that the VC won't see we've been here." So he was still defending himself against the enemy, concealing himself from the enemy, even though he was no longer in Vietnam, and even though he never carried a rifle in Vietnam. He insisted he would never carry a rifle. He was going to be a combat medic if he was going to get drafted. So anyway, that was a signal moment in my friendship with Russell, was seeing him field strip that cigarette. But anyway, we keep walking along the avenues, and as we're walking along, this car pulls up to the curb next to us. This big Monte Carlo, sea green Monte Carlo. It pulls up to the curb next to us, and you can hear the electric window going down. Down goes the window, and there's this guy in there, kind of fat, with big, loud paisley tie and greasy hair, and he's like asking a question, and Russell stops and like leans over to answer the question, whatever that question might have been, and the guy pulls out a snub-nosed revolver and points it at Russ. That pistol was maybe a foot and a half from Russell's face, and I saw that. And like without thinking, I grabbed Russell by the back of the jacket and spun him around so that now that pistol was at my back. And I was pushing on Russell, pushing him into this alcove of one of the homes there in the avenues as the car sped away. And the guys were laughing, they were laughing at these obvious hippies or something that they had intimidated with their pistol. But the guy who pointed that pistol at Russ thought that he'd won some great manly victory. But what he didn't realize was, in that moment, he proved to me that there's a love that one man can have for another man, that is a completely chaste love, that is a complete self-sacrificing love. A willingness to die for the other guy, like a combat medic might do. That willingness to die for the other guy, and the fact that it happened without my thinking about it, taught me something about the way we as men are made. We're made to love each other in a chaste and self-sacrificing way. It's in our very nature, and the guy didn't even realize he'd taught me that lesson by his evil action. But there it is, the day that Russell and I walked the avenues.